Thank you, everybody. I just took myself off mute, so hopefully you can all hear me pretty well. Yeah.
Yes.
So again, it's an honor. My name is David Acosta, and my pronouns are he, his, and él. I'm a second generation Latino that grew up in Southern California, and my parents were immigrated to the United States as teenagers. And my mother's family is from Sonora, and my father's family is from Jalisco. So you can imagine the interesting dialogues we had when we had big dinners and we had both abuelitas from both different parts of the country, how they argued over how to prepare the food properly and what was misproperly fed as well. But I gather from that, I mentioned my parents only because my father didn't get past sixth grade, and my mom didn't get past eighth grade as they were pulled out to work in the huertas. But they knew the value of education. And so I'm really proud to be a fourth child of five boys. All of us are college graduates and gone on to professional careers. And again, it was instrumental to have the parents who really believed in education and really believed in a better plight for us as well. And I'm also very proud and honored to be here because I am a past LMSA faculty advisor at two different institutions. So it's wonderful to see this come to fruition. And so I applaud not only LMSA, but also the planning committee that put together. And the speakers are just amazing today. And it was a delight to be on since this morning to kind of see the value of that as well, too. And so today I was asked to go ahead to really kind of set the framework for our discussion of this panel. We have a powerful panel today, and I'm really excited about that. And I've named my part of this session called The Power of Hispanic Latinx Leadership. And I will be using terms interchangeably as well. And again, being in a boomer generation, my way I've self-identified myself as Latino. And so you'll see me also representing that throughout today as well. Again, what I thought I'd go ahead and do is go ahead and set the framework from a quote from Dr. Maria Chavez, who's an associate professor in political science at Pacific Lutheran University in Washington State. And I was really inspired by the book that she wrote called Everyday Injustice, Latino Professionals and Racism. And she came at the angle really from speaking about professionals that are lawyers as well. But a lot of what she had to say, I think, in the book, and I highly recommend the book, is really applicable to us in academic medicine as well. And so let me read this to you because I think it really resonates and sets some of the framework of what has already been said and what I hope is that these next 2 days in the summit will be covered. The quote is, "We know Latinos are racialized in this country. When the most successful members of the Latino community, those who have, quote, done everything right, unquote, regularly experience discrimination. And this paradoxically demonstrates how deep racism and discrimination run in America." So I'd have to say this resonated so much with me because, again, after 20 years of doing this work in DEI, I have, and in spite of all the different initiatives and programs that I've had the luxury and the honor to develop, and the same types of programs we develop across the country, and a lot of our medical schools are doing well. I've come to the conclusion now in my ripe old age that we have a systems problem. We've always had a systems problem. And I think we're now, with the racial reckoning that is happening, that this is the time that we have to move beyond what we've already done. And the next generation work, I believe, is that we really need to think about how do we change the system that we are a part of. And I'll get into that in just a little bit. But I think the quote that everybody knows about and has heard about, I think actually puts this also into perspective. And that's one from Michael Arsenault, who's also an activist and also a speaker and an author as well. He's the one that coined the phrase that said, quote, "The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed." And I want us to think about that throughout this whole afternoon and over these next couple of days as well. Because again, it's that system that we probably need to pay a lot more attention to than we have really given credit for. So my agenda today is the following. Really briefly, I'm going to cover the rationale for enhancing LHS positive leadership in academic medicine. A shout out to JP. JP had used a new acronym, so just want to make sure I go on record for that as well. And again, we could spend a whole week and have a full summit on talking about all the rationale. But I'm just going to focus on three. Secondly, I've been asked also to present the present landscape of what we know from the data about LHS positive, LHS plus presentation and leadership positions in the academy. And then I'm going to also kind of try to catalyze some thought, not only just for our session, but also for the breakouts and for the other speakers as well, to explore some important topics that we don't necessarily talk a lot about in academia. And that is just the Latino identity. What does that mean? And again, do our leaderships really understand what that means? But also, do we also recognize the power of our own Latino leadership as well? And I'll cite that in a little bit about what has come out on that. Secondly, my hope is to set up the panel to really we have some executive leadership now at this panel. So what are some of the inhibitors that executive leadership are up against? What are some of those system-based inhibitors that we need to know? Because again, we're still, I'll show you a 40-year trend on the landscape of representation of just LHS positive faculty. The reality is, if we put people in these leadership positions, why haven't we changed? If we know the problem, we have illustrated the data, why haven't we been able to move that needle? And also, again, we've got two incredible leaders on this panel that also have been very successful as well. So what are those effective practices that the executive leadership would recommend to other executive leadership that need to know? And hopefully we will all get to the point of, in our final part of the panel, having our executive leadership address, where does the academy really need to go given these problems and stuff? So let me do a whirlwind through the rationale. And the three that I poke are the following. Again, I think studies cite pretty clearly that the Hispanic Latinx population is growing. There's no question about that. We've known that. We've heard so many quotes about that. And this is just something that comes from Statista that basically looks at the most recent predictions in the forecast. Presently right now, studies cite that Latinos represent 1 in 6 presently, but by 2035 will increase to 1 in 4. In 2019, the Latino population represented 18% of the total US population. And presently, we're at about 60.6 million Latinos across the country. And we're a very heterogeneous group. We don't come from the same cloth necessarily. Again, and that's what's on the side panel. Still predominantly in the United States, Mexicanos have the highest percentages across the United States. But again, it's very geographical differences as well between East Coast, West Coast. And I learned that the hard way by learning moving to the East Coast and realized that essentially Puertorriqueños, El Salvadorians, and Dominicans, are very plentiful on the East Coast that we don't really necessarily see on the West Coast. But we have to be sensitive to that as well. And I think the other thing I want to also state while we're talking about this, and this is really aimed at a reminder to our US politicians, is that statistically we know that 4 in every 5 Latinos living in the United States, or 80%, are US citizens. I'll let that sink in just for a little bit because I think that's a really important piece. Any of the projections for 2035, as you see on this graph, is that Latinos are projected to increase to about 81 million and by 2035, and by 2050 to 99.8 million. However, as my longtime friend Fernando Mendoza, pediatrician, would always remind us at many of these particular talks, that we're already there when you think about the kids. Right? That they already are the majority in the United States, and we don't pay attention to that. And in fact, I just saw recent data that was really eye-opening. In 2020, the children already 1 in 4 children enrolled in US K through 12 schools are Latino. 1 in 6 students enrolled in college are Hispanic and Latino as well. And again, the interesting thing about all these demographics, when you see that we represent 18% of the population, the reality is that we only represent 5.5% of all medical school faculty, and that's atrocious if you think about that. And it's been like that. I'll show you over the last 40 years, we've barely budged the needle on that sort of thing. So given what the immediate future of our demographic change, you'd think it would really behoove our executive leadership to have Latinos at the table to better prepare themselves for what's coming down the line in the future. Secondly, I think the second rationale is that there needs to be a focus to understand and address the Latino community issues, especially around health inequities and health disparities, which are the health of the Latino community and provide focused research agenda in that matter and stuff. We bring a different perspective to the table that our non-Hispanic colleagues cannot and will not bring. The injustices that were laid bare by the pandemic for some people, although, say caveat, many of us in the audience have known about these inequities for a long, long time, because we were personally involved with our own families that suffered from these inequities, or because we were in communities that suffered the same. And some of us have even been doing research for years on this. And so sometimes I cringe when I hear this whole thing. I think, well, the pandemic laid this bare. But the reality is that those who've been doing to this just shake our heads, that this has not been around. This is not new. I'm grateful for the pandemic to basically open the eyes, made it more visible to those that thought it was invisible. But I think the important piece about this is that there's been an overwhelming burden, and especially in Latinos as depicted by this slide by the CDC that they provided throughout the pandemic as well. That the number of cases, the number of hospitalizations, the number of deaths in comparison to white non-Hispanic persons is overwhelming and continues to be so. So that begs the question, so would these injustices have been as prevalent as they were if we had more Latinx leaders in positions of power and decision-making that could have and would have influenced the system? I don't know the answer to that, but it's something that we really need to pay attention to as well. And then lastly, what I'm going to cover is just, again, we all know this adage, if you can see it, you can be it. Many of us that do pipeline programs recite that to our students, sort of thing, as we try to introduce them to role models and mentors that look like them, that have similar backgrounds. But it's pretty clear. I chose just at random, just before this talk, okay, I'm just going to go to a number of medical schools and just pick out pictures that I see, thinking and pretending that, okay, I'm a pre-health student, I'm a medical student, I'm a resident, I'm an early career faculty that's interested in things, and what did I see? And if you look across the pictures, what the photos, the faces in the photos are examples of what Hispanic and Latinx students, residents and fellows, early career and mid-career faculty see when they visit our medical school and teaching hospital websites and research centers as well. And just to orientate you, the one down at the very bottom in the middle is the Council of Deans that the AAMC as a supports and sponsors as well. And then on the very far, your very far right, the picture with lots of people in it is the Leadership Council for an Ivy League university. And again, if you look really closely, there's not a Latino in any of these pictures. So again, I think the important piece about this is it's just that realization that there is a stark absence and a lack of Latino representations in all leadership positions in the academy. And again, despite those of us that are in leadership positions, we're still invisible to society. And we're still invisible to other leaders that are in power and decision-making positions at all levels, not only just in academic medicine, but even outside in other health professions as well. So given the quote, from Dr. Chavez that I just initially read to spark this session, is this intentional? We have to ask ourselves that because of the system that's in place. And I would say, so let's look at where everyone looks to in order to answer such questions. And so let's look at the data. So truth be told, here lies one of the many problems that we have. Because in our academy, we have an incomplete data set. In our academy, we do not have the data that identifies accurately how many Latinx faculty are in leadership positions. And as I've depicted on this particular slide, AAMC does track some of the data, but we don't track it all. And maybe this is something that, again, our breakout sessions could begin talking about what data don't we have that we should look at? Because we have little or no data in part-time faculty that are volunteer faculty. And especially those first two bullets represent a large portion of our URM faculty that are participating in our medical schools, but yet when we do our data, we only focus on full-time faculty. What about center directors, departmental division heads, vice deans and senior associate deans, associate and assistant deans? We have a play because some of the data is there if we look really hard, but we don't have an area where there's a robust collection of that data. But I will show you some of the data that we do have. Today I'm just going to cover really briefly where are we in 2021 from the best data that we have on full-time faculty by race and ethnicity, ranking, looking at department chairs and deans. Some of this was covered a little bit earlier on, but I want to give you the hard and fast of the most recent data that's there as well. So there was a wonderful study that just came out that looked over at the last 40 years about full-time faculty across the United States and U.S. medical schools that I would invite you to take a look at that. It was by Imam Zarali. Imam Zarali used to work at the AAMC and now he is at Southwestern University. And he and colleagues just published this that I think kind of sets the tone really nicely. And so let me just kind of go through the legend. It's sometimes a little bit hard to see. But they looked at data from 1979 to 2018, looking at using the AAMC faculty roster data. And so this was depicted on this particular graph as a clinical science full-time faculty by URM status. You can see my arrow at the top. This represents non-URM males. The other graph in the middle represents non-URM females. And then down below, and I pause only because this always catches my breath. These two bars down here represent URM males and URM females. So what do we know from what we know this? Overall, we know that full-time faculty increased from about 50,000 in 1979 to an all-time high in 2018 of about 175,000. In most of this was in the clinical sciences. In the clinical sciences, faculty increased fourfold in those years. But also what you'll find is the proportion of people that did increase came from the non-URM male and non-URM female groups as well. And if you looked at stark difference down below, there was very little change that we did see over the years. There has been a change, but very little change. I'm proud to say that in this particular study, the greatest rise for URM faculty was actually in Hispanic Latinx faculty. In 1979, there was about 1,200 faculty at that time, representing about 2.9% of all faculty at U.S. medical schools at that time. And in 2018, that rose to 5.5% where we are today. And that rose about 9,700. Clearly, there's also been more gains for URM females compared to URM males. And this is more apparent in the clinical departments than it is in the basic science departments as well. And the other interesting thing that also was cited in this particular study that I think is really important is that AAMC had an initiative to expand medical school capacity back around 2006, 2004, essentially. And again, from that, faculty increased by about 57.9% from about 111,000 in 2002 to about 175,000 in 2018. But the proportion of URM faculty, here's an opportunity now, right? But with that opportunity, the proportion of URM faculty that barely increased by about 2% over that same period of time. They went from 7% in 2002 to about 9.4% in 2018. The basic sciences, again, on this next slide, depicts a very similar picture as well. We see that similar pattern that mostly benefited from that increase were non-URM males and non-URM females, with a paucity about the increases when you can look at the URM males and the URM females. The increase in basic sciences in all faculty was about 1.8 fold from about 11,000 to about 19,000, where we presently are at. This is just a deeper dive and looking at 2018, kind of where we are as well. But I want to caution you about reading how you read the numbers, because the ones that I've highlighted here, that are highlighted in this table, when you see these percentages next to it, it only reflects the percentage of the males, the percentages of females, and not of the total whole. So what I want to give you in 2018, the total number of full-time faculty was about 175,326 faculty members. 89% of that was full-time faculty in the clinical sciences. And essentially 11.2% was in the basic sciences. When you really reflect on the Latino, the Hispanic full-time faculty, that represented about 5.5% of all faculty. So that number really hasn't changed from essentially what was cited, I think, early on as well. In the clinical sciences, when you disaggregate it down to just the clinical sciences, Hispanic Latino full-time faculty represented about 5.6% of all faculty in clinical sciences, and in the basic sciences, they represented about 4.4%. Moving right along, this really talks about rank, and I'm not going to belabor this and spend a lot of time on this, but essentially the important piece about this one is in 2020, the total number of full-time faculty we had is in this box, 184,682. And 21% of that were professors, 20.4% were associate professors, and 47% of those were assistant professors, and about 11% were in the other category. If we look at the legend basically stands as this. The gray bar represents professors, the orange bar represents associate professors, and the blue bar represents assistant professors, to give you an idea of how we've compared as Latinos, that is depicted here as the third bullet down. And just in a nutshell, those that have achieved professorship that were Latino represents about 2.5% of all faculty. At the associate professor level, represents about 3.1%, and at the assistant professor level, 3.6%. Not depicted on the slide is American Indian and Alaska Native. It's only because when you begin looking at the indexes of the variables that we're using, they were too small. Professorship, there's only 39. That's 2-digit, 39 complete professors who are American Indian, Alaska Native. 71 are associate professors, and 133 are assistant professors as well. And this is just kind of a quick breakdown that I thought was a wonderful slide from the State of Women in Academic Medicine that was published in 2020. Apologize for that. Just to give you an idea about Latina women, and this depicts who is at full professorship, associate professorship, assistant, and instructor. And it also compares to some of the other women. At the top, represented by purple, are white women. Asian Americans are represented as the second one, which is done in dark green. But I've pointed to the ones where Latina women are represented. They represent 3% of the full professors, 3.5% of associate professors, 3.4% of assistant professors, and about 3.3% in instructors. Moving on to department chairs, the United States Medical Schools, the latest data we have is in 2020, and this the fact comes from the faculty roster dated in December 31 of 2020. The total number of department chairs in 2020, and that's depicted in gray as the total number. Clinicals in orange, and basic sciences are in blue. And we depicted them by non-Hispanic white, Asian American, Hispanic Latinx, African American Black, and AIAN. And what you'll find is that in 2020, there were 3,202 department chairs. The large majority were in clinical sciences at about 75%. The largest number of department chairs were non-Hispanic white in 2020, representing 77% of the full department chairs, and the majority were men in both clinical sciences and also the basic sciences as well. And in comparison, you'll see that in the this column right here, and this data set there. Latinos and Hispanics represented 113 of all the department chairs in the United States of all medical schools, which is about 3.5% of all department chairs. In the basic sciences, Latino represented 3.2%, and those were specifically in biochemistry, microbiology, and physiology. And in the clinical space arena, Hispanics represented about 3.6 of all the department chairs. And I have to say, I was pretty biased because I thought it was going to be in the primary care specialties, but the number one specialty that had the highest number of Latinos in the clinical sciences was actually surgery. Pediatrics was second, OBGYN was third, psychiatry was fourth, followed by family practice and internal medicine. And then lastly, we're looking at the Dean's Report, the most recent that we have right now. And the difficult part about this is because there are many interim deans that are in place. The attrition of deans have to come into place as well. But this hasn't changed very much when you begin looking at this particular box. Non-Hispanic whites represent over 82% of all deans in all of our medical schools today, and only 11.2% represent URM deans, and Latinos represent 3.3%. Unfortunately, I don't have the breakdown by gender as well. So the next thing I'm going to move into really quickly is just this notion of Latino identity and the power of that identity in that. And I think it's well covered by this quote that I found from Raul Izaguirre. He was a past president and CEO of the National Council de la Raza from 1974 to about 2004, and also became U.S. ambassador to the Dominican Republic from 2010 to 2013. But I thought his quote really kind of set this tone around Latino identity that I wish that I would send to every executive leadership member across the nation. And it says, quote, "I treasure who I am. I treasure who my parents were, my culture, my language, and I don't have to give any of that up in order to succeed. Indeed, if I keep all those things in play, if I keep all those things, it will make me more successful in practical terms as well as in self-fulfilling terms. Latinos have a unique contribution to make to America, and we can't do that if we give up our cultural core, that which makes us who we are." And so what I want to do is kind of spar some questions to really think, catalyze some self-reflection, because I think these are really important questions that we ourselves have to answer. These are questions that are going to require a lot of self-reflection and some of the hard truth that we really have to kind of begin admitting, begin bringing to the table so we can better understanding how we change the system to meet the needs. Because the biggest questions, and my hope is that these questions also that our speakers today and also throughout this conference should consider answering during their presentation, their Q's and A's, but also in our breakout sessions that each of us also basically are allowed to feel safe to basically answer some of these things. And there are questions that I hope that will educate not only our executive panel, but maybe some of the executives back at your institutions when you head back. So the major question is, what holds us back? You know, I contend that we do have a systems problem, as I mentioned before, because we exist in an educational system, an academy that has a white social frame embedded throughout its system. That means its policies, its governments, its infrastructure, our processes and how we hire, who we admit, and the list goes on. It's a system that does not recognize or value cultural identity. And a quote from Dr. Joe Fagan, who's done a lot of this work on the white social frame, is this. It says, quote, "Latinos have been racialized as non-white and thus experience discrimination in countless ways." So I ask, isn't it time that we begin addressing the system and maybe offer a counterframe to that as well? A counterframe we're already doing, just to kind of put it in perspective for those who may not be familiar with white social frame. You know, the motivation that we have to become physicians, to become researchers, to become medical educators, we do this really so we can be at the table, so that we can combat discrimination of Latinos from receiving quality, culturally and linguistic responsive, comprehensive, evidence-based, effective and efficient, equitable healthcare. We do this because we also want to be at the table outside of our realm. As was mentioned by Joe Greer earlier on, that he's been involved in many other organizations, agencies outside the sphere of health, because we have to be at that table to ensure that our communities will have access to quality education, housing, voting rights, job opportunities, and the list goes on and on. We have an obligation for that. We also have an educational system within the academy that expects us to assimilate to this white social frame. And we know the adage is, the quiet, unspoken word is that if we do this, and we do this without complaint, we will be promoted and we will thrive. We also know that if we don't do this, we are marked and sometimes even targeted as that difficult faculty member. But as depicted in that quote by Raul Izaguirre, who has, preserving our cultural identity is important to us. And we do that by being culturally adaptive. The question is, does our executive leadership, are they really aware of this? Do they understand? Do they really understand and respect this piece of what we're up against, how we try to to preserve our cultural identity. Does this hold us back? Do we not want to challenge that status quo because it's too risky for our career? Do we see ourselves in leadership positions? Do we even possess that leadership identity? So how does that connect with our Latino identity or the other multiple identities that each of us carry that make up who we truly are? So what holds us back? Understandably, there's no question about this because this can be private and very personal. But we also should not try to put the answers to this question in one box, given the heterogeneity of who we are and what makes us up. We each individually have our own reasons that need to be recognized and understood, as we are all not the same. And again, I ask our executive leadership, are you aware of this? Please do not put us in one box because we are different and we have different talents and we have different journeys and different lived experiences. And so the real question I'm going to leave with you is, what systems issues really need to be addressed and really need to be changed? Does our cultural identity, does that contribute to your leadership attributes needed? Have you ever thought about that? Do we see our cultural identity as an asset, or do we see it related to where we are in our institution, or do we see that as a detriment? And what impression does our executive leadership have about our identity? Does identity even matter to our executive leadership? Do they recognize and understand the terminology identity interference? For those of you in the audience that may not understand what that is, that occurs when there are cultural meetings in society and stereotypes in society that is essentially assigned to your social identity, in this case being Latino. But also, they cause us that have multiple identities to feel that one identity of ours, of all multiple identities, interferes with a successful performance. And sometimes we are mentored, we are coached to say, forget the Latino identity, assimilate to the white identity, and only think about one, science identity. If you're going to prosper, if you're going to thrive here. The idea that we have to choose what identity that we are going to basically reveal and hold back everything else that makes us up is something to be dealt with and that we have to really address. And so an example would be Latino cultural identity, we are told, interferes with science identity, and therefore my performance as a research scientist, therefore I should only focus on my science identity, assimilate to the dominant white male culture, and minimize my Latino identity. And just in passing, and I could talk a little bit more about this as well. This is a wonderful book that was written by Juana Borges on the power of Latino leadership. And as those that are Latinos that are in this audience that are looking at these 10 Latino principles, it speaks to you. I know it does, because this is what a lot of us have grown up with in that sense. Our DNA is programmed much differently when it comes to leadership. And again, our executive leadership needs to know that. We lead in different ways that our dominant majority group leads. They are more hierarchical, they're more self-centric, they're more self-serving, and they're more power-oriented, which is actually opposite of how Latinos leadership prevail, how they operate, because they're more egalitarian. Again, it's more about a collective whole. It's about the community. It's about a we orientation. It's about interconnectedness. It's about everyone has inherent worth and value. It's about always bringing in that cultural balance when we do strategic thinking and problem solving, and it's also about simpático and respect for people as well. So again, what can you need to ask ourselves is, what can we teach our colleagues about these leadership principles that really resonate to who we are? And I think we're finally finding voice words to use to help them understand, because I think that's a critical piece for us to move forward. And so I'll leave it with these questions, and it's not for me to answer these, but hopefully to stimulate some conversation later on as well, is that when you really ask yourself the questions, if you really stand back and ask, what does our executive leadership really need to know about us? Asking questions such as, what do you know about our lived experiences of Latinx faculty? Do you know about the challenges? Do you know about the barriers? What are some of the system-based inhibitors of success that are unique to Latinx faculty? Do you know what those are? And more importantly, if you've been in other leadership positions, what promising and effective practices have you put in place for advancing Latino faculty into leadership positions? as I mentioned at the very end, my hope is that maybe we can also concentrate on where do we need to go as an academy altogether. So with that, I will stop and stop sharing my screen. And Monica, I will give it back to you.
Gracias, Dr. Acosta. That was beautiful. And in particular, I think many of us in the audience felt the love and pride that we all have in being part of this community. I do think that we need to be careful when we use terms like DNA and race, keeping in mind that race is a social construct and that it's our lived experience that builds our culture and that we pass down generation after generation. And so these qualities are things that we teach ourselves and we teach our children. They may not often be in keeping with white American leadership profiles, but wow, do we bring so much to the table. So I very much appreciate everything that you said. I do wonder if we can just go back to the data for a minute and ask ourselves whether many of our community members do not reach senior leadership roles because we exit academic medicine as junior faculty. Do we know whether that is true?
Again, more robust data that I think we need to look at. We can follow some of the trajectory of some, especially from some of our programs that we have, such as the minority faculty leadership summits that we do. We follow those trainings over time, and in fact, we're about ready to publish our 20-year history about that to kind of see. And what we're finding is that if you do this, much like ELAM, much like many of the other things, including we have a particular certificate program to create the next chief diversity officer that's only been around for about 8 years, we're starting to see that it makes a difference. You know, the COD fellowship that Manny mentioned as well, again, is something we're starting to see that. It's not in great numbers, but the problem is because in these particular programs, we don't have a lot of numbers of people participating either. So again, I think one of the things that as we look down the line, one of my suggestions is going to be, how do we begin looking at and how can we expand leadership academies, not just relying on Ben Gap or not just relying on the usual suspects, but how can each of our associations, how can organized medicine see the urgency, the sense of urgency we have, and why not create it? And you know, we're at a time that ultimately all of us that are minority, all of us that are in the URM category, you know, we have unique experiences. And so if we make one that is really related to Latino leadership and one that is made it for African-American, Black leadership, and the list goes on with all our population groups, there's something to be said about that and to respect that because of that cultural identity piece. There are things that are common, but there are many more things that are different. And we actually lead in different ways that we need to respect and pull that into our leadership academy.
I'm going to ask that we hold our questions for Dr. Acosta for a second and allow Dr. Skorton to present next because he has he has a conflict, and we'll come back and actually address all three speakers with questions at the end. Dr. Skorton.
Thank you very much, Monica. And I do apologize to everyone. Some time ago, I was asked to address President Biden's COVID-19 Health Equity Task Force, and I was able to negotiate the time with them a little bit later this afternoon, so I wouldn't have to miss this wonderful conference. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be back with LMSA today. One of my last in-person visits before the pandemic struck was at the LMSA meeting in St. Louis about 1.5 years ago. That was a wonderful experience, and I'm grateful to have the chance to be with this wonderful organization again. And I'm constantly learning about the very important and growing contributions of all communities to our collective missions in academia. And as you can imagine, working with Dr. Acosta at the AAMC for the last 2 years that I've been there has been an amazing experience. And I tell him and others all the time that I'm his student, and you can see how much fun it will be to be Dr. Acosta's students. One of the things that I'm also learning is the appropriate ways, of course, to refer to groups of people. And I will use the term LHS plus today, but please know that I mean to be inclusive by that term, and that when I say LHS plus, I mean everybody. So our distinguished colleagues are sharing enormous wisdom. You just heard what I thought was an amazing talk by Dr. Acosta. Wisdom about the journey we are all on and how you can claim your place at the table, including how you can claim your place at the head of the table. Well, what can I do to add to that wisdom? So I want to speak for the next few minutes, not only and not even predominantly from my position leading the AAMC, but from a career-long experience in administrative positions in higher education. I've been blessed with a variety of leadership positions in higher education, and I learned from each one of them. And since diversity, equity, and inclusion have long been my highest priority in every one of these positions, I've spent much time watching and honestly learning from the mistakes that I made and others have made. Unfortunately, as Dr. Acosta's data and much other data shows, the academic establishment in this country has failed to move the needle over my academic career is coming close to a half a century. And in many areas, including the areas that Dr. Acosta pointed out today, we have barely moved the needle at all. And so I want to share today what I've learned from some of those mistakes. Now, I think the first responsibility of leadership, and Dr. Acosta used the term executive leadership, but I'm going to say leadership at any level in a complex organization. I believe the first responsibility of leadership in any field when it comes to inclusion is actually to cultivate the ability to see a much wider variety of individuals as more than capable of taking on increasing responsibilities. I'm going to put it a different way, the opposite way. If leaders do not actually see a broader range of individuals as more than capable of taking on additional leadership responsibilities, then diversification and advancement will not occur, no matter how many programs of various kinds we try. In my view, in the case of LHS Plus colleagues, there is this added, quite critical learning that leaders must undertake to understand the tremendous diversity within the LHS Plus community. And I want to ask you to bear with me as I tell you a tiny bit about my personal history. So like Dr. Acosta, I'm a second generation American, and my family came over from Russia. My dad's side came over during the influenza pandemic about 100 years ago. And he was 9, and they had a lot of influenza on the boat. And so they did the thing that people sometimes do. They diverted it to Cuba. And my dad lived in Cuba for about 3 years. And to the day he passed away, rest in peace, about 40 years ago, he spoke English, Russian, a little bit of Yiddish, and Spanish with a Cuban idiom. And so in our home, when I was a kid, he tried to teach me a little Spanish and speak Spanish at home. But more importantly, he tried to drive home the lesson for me. And this is over 40 years ago, actually much more than 40 years ago, that the LHS Plus community worldwide, and of course he didn't use that term, that they are not all the same. And to paraphrase a phrase that was used by a late colleague of mine in higher education, he was referring to a different population as what he called a mosaic, not a monolith. And because I think many leaders do not understand the incredible richness and variety of the LHS Plus community, they tend to miss the possibilities of ways that individuals can contribute in as many different ways as there are backgrounds. This is so true of LHS Plus colleagues and leaders, and they must internalize, the leaders must learn and internalize this truth. The next thing that I've learned, again, by mistakes I've made and by following other leaders, other university presidents and so on, is that leaders must be intentional and deliberate in working to diversify our institutions, from the brand new student all the way to the top leadership positions? Well, that's easy to say. It sounds like rhetoric. What would actually motivate this kind of intentionality? And what will finally break the logjam to make this intentionality effective? Well, first, of course, good intentions are a critical first step. But as we know, good intentions and the rhetoric that go along with them are not enough. Next, and this is a very important piece in my experience, is the willingness to be humble and to learn and to ask others for continuing learning, no matter the heights the leader may have reached. And it's very possible for a leader, and I'll say of any background, to start to believe their own press statements and believe that because they have reached a certain title, they have a very broad grasp of things that all fall under the rubric of what they are leading. But it's important to understand that we all have more to learn all the time. In this regard, I repeat that I view myself as Dr. Acosta's student, and it's a rare week that I don't learn something from him, either based on data or other elements to further inform my own thinking. But the most important, I believe, is the acceptance of accountability. Even with the other elements that I think are so important that I just mentioned, if there is no personal accountability to make a difference, there is a very, very small probability that a difference will actually occur. I believe very strongly that boards of whatever kind of organization, the governance process should hold top leadership accountable for two aspects of diversity and inclusion at our institutions. Number one, the composition of the institution in all of its different divisions and areas and categories, composition. And the other one is the climate of the institution. Because in my experience, no matter how effectively we can recruit a diverse student body, especially a diverse workforce, if the climate of the institution is not such that it feels safe and the person feels likely to succeed, people will not stay at the institution. And so I believe it's important that boards hold the person at the top accountable for both composition and climate of the institutions. But that's not enough. Then I believe these top leaders should in turn hold the next level of leaders accountable, and that they in turn should hold the next level of leaders accountable, and so on throughout the entire organization. If this is done, and if the accountability is real accountability, shows up, for example, in annual evaluations, then there's a chance, not necessarily a likelihood, but a chance that we can make some progress. And we're trying this experiment at the AAMC. I asked when I first got there, within about 2 months, for the board of directors of the AAMC to hold me accountable on my annual evaluation, in part for the composition and climate of the AAMC. And as Dr. Acosta will attest, I've assigned that accountability to every one of the chiefs, Dr. Acosta to the very top of the organization, and he and the other 14 chiefs have this accountability, and they've adopted it as a leadership executive body, an enterprise-wide accountability for composition and climate. Another extremely important avenue for education to occur upward, so to speak, is the concept of shared governance. Top leadership, no matter whether the top leadership has been there 6 months, 6 years, or 20 years, top leadership needs to continue to learn by listening regularly to input garnered directly from students, to input garnered directly from faculty, to input garnered directly from staff, and to input garnered directly from other leaders. Hopefully, your institution already has some ready and effective mechanisms for such shared governance through, for example, a faculty senate or an assembly or other means. If so, take advantage of it. Make it as effective as it can be. Participate, even though it's more time, it's very important. But what if not? What if there is not an organized, formal shared governance system or an effective one? then get one started or make suggestions to the very top of the organization that this be done. And you're free to quote me if that would help. If it wouldn't help, forget about it. But I feel very strongly about that. And finally, before I close these brief formal remarks, we can have time for some questions. Let me speak to leaders throughout higher education who hopefully, maybe some of them are listening with us today or will see this later on. I'm asking you as fellow leaders, get to know the LHS Plus colleagues more directly. And if you haven't had the privilege and joy of working with them, do it as soon as possible. And you will learn something that will help your life and the institution. I thank you, Dr. Vela, for the honor of participating today. I look forward to questions and more discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Skorton. You said an awful lot. You said it directly to us, and for that, we're grateful. I think I heard you say that not a lot of change has occurred for a long period of time, that we can't lean or wait for minds to change or hearts to change. We need to take action. That made me think about the 2 times in my position as a DE&I officer that the AAMC and the LCME played their hand in my favor. The first was when my institution failed to be accredited on diversity. And everyone bemoaned that while I walked into my office, closed the door, and cried happy tears that this might direct some resources in my direction. And the second was when the LCME changed its language regarding diversity in 2009 and changed the word should to must, so that institutions really had to pay attention to those accreditations. And actually, Dr. Boatwright just recently published a paper in JAMA demonstrating that that simple change led to what was one of the first significant increases in Black and LHS representation in medical schools. How do we add another accreditation level requiring, making another must, that there be LHS and African American representation at all levels of leadership, that this shared governance be critical and obvious? How do we petition the AAMC to change that language and make us a more urgent priority?
So I hope, Dr. Velo, that this doesn't sound like a dodge, but the way the LCME works, the AAMC itself doesn't interact with accreditation standards, nor does the AMA. The AMA and the AAMC co-sponsor the LCME, which legally is an independent phenomenon. And so you know that Dr. Acosta and my heart are in the right place. We have no direct ability to do that. However, the LCME takes all kinds of recommendations and considers them, of course. Every consideration brought to them, from my view, indirectly, is something that they balance, because every must that is put in is something that the medical school is required to do. I think the best thing you can do, if you wish, is to directly interact with the LCME. And offline, if you write me, and I'm going to put my direct email to me in the chat in a second here. Anybody is more than welcome. It would be lovely to hear from you. But you write me about this, and I'll find out the right mechanism for you to do that. It's a very, very, very important question, and it falls under that category of accountability for sure. In the meantime, must or not, in some standard from the LCME, you, especially leaders like you who are rising stars in the universe, need to make sure that that shared governance mechanism is real in your institution. And I know a bit about the wonderful institution that you're at. Not that I was ever there. I never could have gotten in there academically for real. But I used to play in a band that performed at 55th and King, not too far from where your office probably is. But I got to know the campus a little bit. And I think that you have some mechanisms for shared governance at that institution within divisions and otherwise. And I can't stress enough how important it is to become part of that push to get these things done, even while you're thinking about an LCME or ACGME mechanism, depending what you're talking about. It's a really great question. And while the next question's coming, I'm going to quick type my address in so I don't forget.
Yes, I want to encourage everyone to please throw their questions into the chat. Dr. Skorton has limited time with us, and we so appreciate that he is spending that time with us. Thank you, Dr. Skorton.
And the really hard questions, of course, you should send to Dr. Acosta, but you should send me the pop flies and send Dr. Acosta the line drives.
Well, I'll pose a quick question, Dr. Vela. Thank you so much, Dr. Skorton, for joining us for today's seminar. As we think about opportunities to serve in the AAMC structure, can you talk a little bit about what current participants should consider in applying to? I think, you mentioned the board of directors for AAMC and other senior leadership posts that might be open or opening in the near future, just like we're encouraging the participants to apply to be deans of medical schools and chairs of departments. In terms of the AAMC board of directors, how is that process to being nominated and selected? And then are there any openings in your senior leadership team?
So our senior leadership team right now, going to be very open with you. We have one opening that's going to be posted soon for a chief information officer, the person in charge of IT. That'll be posted fairly soon. And when I say fairly soon, I mean in the next month or 6 weeks at the outside, so something like that. The other positions are filled right now. The board of directors is above my pay grade. Those are my bosses. And so there's a mechanism that they use it's a self-perpetuating board, like a lot of boards are. You can be very welcome to send me suggestions you may have about people who would be members, potential members, and I'm very, very glad personally to pass them on to the normal process. In doing that, you may want to take a look at who is on the board right now. And the board of the AAMC has some deans on it, some hospital or health system CEOs. It has a public member. It has a student member. It has a resident member. It has other members who are, for example, a associate dean for student affairs. So take a peek at that. But then you talk about the whole broad universe. And we have our distinguished colleague, Juan Amador, is on the call today. I'm trying to think of how many affinity groups we have altogether. I don't know the number, but I know that when you add up the number of people who are involved in our affinity groups, there's 13,000 people. And the only reason I know that number is that when I send an email out to everybody, it's 13,200 email addresses. Juan, I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Do you happen to know offhand the number of affinity groups that we have?
Yes, David, happy to help you out. We have 23 affinity groups at the AAMC, which includes the councils, the organizations, and then the groups. And in a minute, I will put the link in the chat for everyone to take a look at the list.
Thank you. Thank you so much. By the way, I want to take a chance publicly to thank Juan for all he does, an amazing amount of things by steering one of those groups and many other things. But please take a look at the composition of the board, which is obviously the hardest gradient, and then the names of the affinity groups. And to the extent that something feels right for you, look at what they're doing, and you can contact me. You can contact Juan, and we can send you some more information about that. One more quick thing to mention. We have a new strategic plan at the AAMC that you can find easily on our website. And we also have a newly launched Center for Health Justice. And we're launching a think tank, the first time ever in our history, a nonpartisan think tank. And please keep an eye on the AAMC website. And poor Juan, I'm asking him to do all this stuff. He's supposed to be enjoying the conference. But if there's a link you can put to the strategic plan, that would be great if you had a minute just to skim the names of the action plans within the plan. Because if Juan and Dr. Costa would agree, I would say that most of the affinity groups right now are working, at least in part, to see what they can do to align with the strategic plan. And you'll note in the plan, across the 10 action plans, there is a tremendous orientation toward diversity, equity, inclusion, and health equity, which is the reason that I'm giving this talk a little bit later today, because that's the major thrust we've had for the last year and a half. So I hope that helps a little bit. And thank you very much, Juan. He already put it up there. Sometimes he does stuff, Dr. Vela, before I can even get out of my mouth. He has this sort of telepathic thing where he figures out, what needs to be done, whether I said it right or not. So thank you.
I think just as a quick follow-up question, as we talk about career advancement and leadership development, I don't know if Juan or Dr. Gordon or Dr. Acosta can talk about the composition of the BOD, AAMC BOD, and the extent to which LHS Plus is represented currently or in the past, because they would be great to sort of invite and provide that perspective at a future Lead That Is program.
I can tell you right now in general non-quantitative terms that we have insufficient diversity in every aspect. And we have a bit more diversity now than we had in the leadership team, but not enough. We have some more diversity in the board of directors that we've had in the past, and we need more. And we have more diversity than we've had before in the affinity groups, but we need more. And this is not one of those things that some leader says, we always need more. We definitely need more, and we're working to do that.
How are those people selected, Dr. Scorton?
It varies according to the affinity group. For the affinity groups themselves, the cognizant staff, the professional, like Juan Amador, has a role in interacting on that. The board is a self-perpetuating board, like most boards are, where they vote on new folks coming in. And the leadership team, those at the very top of the AAMC, I named those positions. And one thing about diversification that you guys all know is that you can't diversify unless you're hiring. And if you don't hire over a period of time because of the economy or whatever it is, then the best way of diversifying leadership is to promote from within when openings occur. And so that having your hands on both mechanisms, if I could put it that way, when there's fresh openings, of course, we've got to push very, very hard to have, for example, not to go forward with interviews and so on if you don't have a diverse pool. And I've made that a rule of my career. I've had some success. I'm not bragging about it. I wish it was 10 times more. But when I was at the Smithsonian, almost 70% of the senior hires I made when I was secretary of the Smithsonian were women or people of color. But the only way we got there was that we insisted that the pools were diverse and rejected the pools if they were not diverse. Problem with that, it takes longer to do the hire. The strength of it is that you don't go forward with zero chance of diversifying a position or a level in the institution. So just some thoughts about that.
Thank you. Another question about leadership in general. It seems that the way that leadership is selected into positions like deanships and chairships is that they have a successful research career first, a successful career bringing in grant money, and not necessarily selected for leadership skill quality or experience. How do we change that mindset in academic medicine so that we have a broader depth and breadth of people being considered for those positions?
Can't believe I told you ask the hard questions to Acosta, but you asked the hard one to me. That's okay. That's okay. I'm so honored to be here. There's no question that in many institutions, especially very research intensive institutions, that there's a large amount of truth in what you said. And it's also the case, and I want to say this with all respect, that a lot of the things we do in higher education, are on the job training. For example, we all teach, correct? But how many of us have had formal training in teaching? I never had. And I was a full professor at two universities. Few of my colleagues who did teaching, even who got teaching awards, few of them ever took a course in teaching, or let alone have a degree or an area of concentration. So like that aspect and like the leadership aspect, a lot of the things are done with on-the-job training. And so I think there's really three aspects to the answer. One is, if there is this accountability at the top and at levels below the top for diversity, that diversity has to be across a broad range of attributes. Ethnic and racial, international background, all kinds of things need to be dealt in there, including the professional pathway by which someone got there. And so if we had more diversification of thinking in that fashion, then that would go a little bit toward what you're talking about. A second is to have the phenomenon in which someone takes a position that is a stretch position, and that the institution or the level of the institution makes a commitment to that person to supply executive coaching or other things that will help them tenaciously hang on to that new level. And I'll tell you a personal experience, nothing like a lived experience. The first time I was appointed as a university president, the committee that appointed me, the Board of Regents of the state of Iowa, took me aside and said, "We think you're a promising young guy," if you can imagine that I was young at one time. And they said, "We think you're going to probably do a good job, but just in case, a condition of your employment is to have executive coaching." And they assigned a coach to me from the business school who did executive coaching as a specialty. And I met with him frequently and regularly, and everything from minor stuff that sounds silly, like time management, how you handle your calendar, to the larger things that we're talking about, I would have bumbled along for a very long time, Dr. Vela, if I hadn't had that coaching. And so that has to be part of the commitment that the institution makes, whatever the background of the person, but especially if the institution wants to take the risk of broadening the attributes of the people who get leadership positions by whatever set of attributes we're talking about. So that's the second. And then the third one is tightly tied to the second, and that is to make a commitment to the person and to the person's success when the position comes up. Not to have a sink or swim mentality. Look, this is a big job. We're giving you a big break to put you there. I sure hope you can do it, because otherwise we'll show you the door. The idea is to make a commitment to that person like we make a commitment to our students. I want to give you another personal example there. My first year in med school, my dad, who was so beloved to me, was very ill, and I was very distracted. He was in California where I grew up, and I was in Chicago. I was very distracted, and I failed my first test, in a major test in a course at medical school. And a professor took me aside in that course and said, "It looked like you're struggling, and I want you to tell me what's going on, and don't be proud." And I told him what was happening, and he said, "You know, it's hard to get into med school. We made an investment in you. I want you to come around in the evenings." And I had 2 jobs during med school, what perhaps many on this call did. And he said, "I don't care, whatever it is, I want you to come by, and I'm going to work with you, and we're going to get you over this hump." Why wouldn't we do that for every sort of individual that works at one of our institutions? Whether it's a student from a different background, a student from any background who's struggling, a faculty member who's doing something different than he or she has ever done, a person in a new leadership position. That's the sort of thing we need to do, is to make an emotional investment, a financial investment, and a career investment And our institutions normally have such a breadth of expertise available that if you don't have, for example, whatever school you're at, if you don't happen to have a famous business school attached, you can find somebody who has been through that experience before, who wants to be helpful to someone following in their tracks. And so those are three ways that perhaps we can do better.
Thank you, Dr. Skorton. I think what you've said has resonated an awful lot with the group and an awful lot with the prior session we just had. First, that when we are recruited by institutions and programs, they have made a commitment to us. Second, that the onus is also on us to walk into leadership offices, introduce ourselves, make sure people know who we are, what our intentions and dreams are, and ask for help in building skills and experiences. I want to thank you, Dr. Skorton, for taking the time to be with us today. I know that you have some urgent meetings ahead of you, and we hope that you do well and advocate for the very best for everyone.
I will tell you that I'm very honored to be here. I do apologize to you, Dr. Sanchez, and others for leaving early. I am happy that if I have to leave you, I'm doing it to talk to this health equity task force, which is very much oriented toward a lot of these same issues. So congratulations to the LMSA. Please, I'm begging you, keep inviting me to things, because we have St. Louis, now we have this, and heaven willing, one of these days we'll defeat this virus, and then we can start doing things together. Thank you very, very much, and congratulations to everyone.
Thank you. Dr. Dickerman, thank you for being so patient with us. We are delighted that you are with us today and would love for you to share your wisdom.
Are my slides coming up, I hope?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. It is a great honor to be asked to present today. I'm coming from a slightly different perspective. I think we've been talking about the large national institution of medicine and academics. And I was asked to really represent a single organization or institution, because as has been stated, we know we have to change policy. We have to have national movements, but I think in parallel, that should not preclude an individual institution from moving forward. And so I'd like to give the perspective that we've been approaching with our particular organization. Quickly, I have to say, we're not an established medical school quite yet. I'm the founding dean for the proposed Kansas College of Osteopathic Medicine, and we're going through the accreditation process right now with the hope to open our school about a year from this time. And that affords us some great opportunity. I mean, we can hopefully do it right from the beginning. But as was already stated, one of the concerns I think we have is we could also fall in the trap and just create our system exactly the way it is right now. And I think we have to be very, very aware of that. And I think as we look at how do we change the current system, I think we have to begin to get some understanding as why it is that way. And so
Dr. Dickerman, before you proceed, do you mind putting your slides into presentation mode?
Let's see if I can. Let's see. I may not be.
That's okay. We actually can see them just fine. Just thought it might be even better.
Too busy. So, but I.
You can just swap presenter view and slideshow. Just click.
Problem is my computer is automatically doing this. I'm not sure how to pop out, but let me see. If you don't mind, my slides are not too busy, so I'll just keep them as is.
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. Again, I think one problem we have is, and I think this has been brought up, is we tend to be working in a world of constant negotiation versus collaboration. And what I mean by that, I think we tend to look at our resources and the open academic positions and our budgets as limitations. And I'm very much in that world right now where I have so many hires I can offer. I only have so much money. But I think we're beginning to look at these as opportunities. Is how do we use those resources and those positions as opportunities to do the right things, not restrictions. And some very important, I'll give 3 examples of where I think we're beginning to change that. mindset. Just looking at our own recruitment policies as we post positions for faculty, there's a tendency when you write a job description to have an image of an individual that you know has succeeded in this position before. And you tend to write a job position, unfortunately, to represent an individual. And I can guarantee you 9 times out of 10, that's going to be a white male. And I think what we're beginning to look at is how do we create job descriptions that invite? And from working with our HR department, we've begun to look at, we try to make our job postings an invitation. They're broad, they're generalized, and they really focus on the skill set we want, not necessarily all the qualifications you need to complete that job. And I think that has helped us begin to become quite successful in not only beginning to build a diverse faculty, but a tremendously skilled faculty that has skill sets we had never, ever considered in the past. And I think we're similarly, as was brought up earlier, as we begin to recruit students this fall, we want to promote success, not predict it. I can guarantee you, I can pick the perfect student that will graduate medical school. It's a white male with a lot of money and 2 educated parents. But that person's going to succeed in any system. What we want to do is reach out to that individual that has tremendous promise, that will bring different perspectives and help them work and become successful. And I think that's a whole different perspective that we need to begin to focus on. And again, let's give people opportunities. Let's not narrow down the choices and say, well, we only have so many spots. Sorry, but let's say we have so many spots to do it right. And very, very similarly, this really leads in how do we conduct our interview process? Is it a conversation or an interview? And I think what I have learned over the past few months is when I interview potential faculty, as we said, you've met the basic qualifications. Let's have a conversation about what you can bring to our organization. And that's allowed us to go way beyond the traditional skill set and to explore those areas that everybody's really touched on. How does your cultural background, how does your previous experience, how can that contribute to our success and the success of our students? And it's given us a whole entirely different perspective as we look at recruiting our faculty. And we hope we'll do the same when we recruit our students. So in the ideal state, we want to begin to explore hidden talents and use this opportunity to look at the talents that we haven't even known or asked about historically. We're going to seek opportunities with our faculty, students, board members, and those individuals that join our organization. And we really want to take time to learn about those that will be working with and teaching with us for years. This is a relationship. We have to understand that. I think we tend to, as we go through the accreditation process, want to make it a series of check boxes and completion so we can move on. And I think we're learning to say, that's just the beginning. The real end point is looking at building relationships with our faculty, our students, and ultimately with our community. I think another obstacle that many organizations meet, fortunately, we're not quite here, but good is the enemy of great. And I think this is, unfortunately, an obstacle many organizations run into is it's easy when you hit bottom to go up. The problem is many medical schools and many healthcare providers are quite successful. They do well. They produce a number of graduates, very productive graduates. But then when you think about changing, you begin to think about, well, could things get worse? What's the risk if I do become more diverse? If I accept that student that might be a little more challenging, if I take on that faculty that does not have all of the criteria that we've traditionally asked for. And so that's the other side of the coin is, what if we fail? And it was brought up, I think one of the problems we have with many medical people is, I would bet in this room, there are several individuals that have never failed a test, much less had any failure since they fell off a bike. And what we see in students and I think organizations is the fear of failure is greater than the sense of accomplishment. And so what we're trying to promote in our organization, and I would challenge everyone here, is to begin to embrace the joy of accomplishment, not the fear of failure. I mean, as we said, remember the days that you fell off a bike 25 times and the 26th time you made it work. It was one of your proudest moments. And I think we need to look at, sometimes the more times you fall, the accomplishment is even more important. And we as organizations can't be afraid of failure. And as was mentioned earlier, we really have to look at faculty and students as investments. They may stumble. Let's help them get up, and more importantly, succeed. And finally, just quickly, we've heard this statement. I think it was actually a neighbor who was a contractor said, anything's possible given enough time, money, and I would argue humility. And these seem to be the primary obstacles for us all. We have limited time, we have limited money. And unfortunately, I think we're in a profession that humility often gets in the way. We look at personal pride or pride of the organization instead of the accomplishment of the organization. And I think a good way to look at trying to get beyond that is really the moonshot. When we look at the moonshot from the 1960s, you've heard this term moonshot. Over 400,000 men and women across the whole United States had one mission in mind for 10 years, and that was to put men on the moon. And that helped everybody get beyond the limitations of money and time and humility and say, let's focus on this overriding vision and goal and see what we can accomplish. And so what I'm going to leave the group today, and my challenge, maybe a question or challenge, is, what is the moonshot for the Latinx leadership and medical education? And I was exchanging some emails with JP this morning, and I will throw out a potential moonshot. Why would not I don't think we have the time to change medical education, much less healthcare, one unrepresented minority at a time. I mean, let's put this on the table. Medical education has changed very little since the Flexner report, and that was 110 years ago. As we can see, we have a lot of promise in our medical healthcare system, but we can also argue it has failed miserably given the amount of resources we put in. We don't have time to build this one or two people at a time. So here's one challenge I would throw out as a potential moonshot. Why wouldn't LMS, BenGap, all the organizations here start their own medical school? It's not as hard as you think. If I can do it, and I'm serious, I think we have to think big. Why not start a medical school? At least a campus that is dedicated to the Latinx population. It is entirely made up of a Latinx faculty. I think that would be my moonshots that I put out there. So I know I didn't spend a lot of time. I know this is only one organization's view. I am very fortunate I was involved in BenGap because the previous medical school that I was at, my dean in my single institution encouraged me to get involved. And I really do think we overlook what a single institution can do. So with that, I'll end and open up for questions.
What an inspiring, aspiring talk you just delivered. That was that last comment about opening our own medical school, I think, brought a lot of smiles out in our participants. And I wonder, what does it take to open a medical school?
I will tell you, because I'm in the middle of it. It's simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. You'll need money, which I would argue the organizations here could easily raise. You need to work with your accrediting body. I've worked with COCA, which is for the osteopathic schools, LCME. Begin to learn the rules. Find people that have started medical schools and use them as mentors. Don't bring me in as a dean for your school. Bring me in as a mentor. Bring me in as an advisor. But pick JP to be your dean. Already identify someone like that to be the dean. And I guarantee you there's enough energy in this room that you could have an application in and could have a medical school in 3 to 5 years.
I think we should just start calling Dr. Sanchez Dean Sanchez and go from there and just assume this is going to happen.
He didn't ask me to say that, and I think he may not want to be a dean, but I think you have the expertise, the energy. That's what you need. You need passion. That's the one thing you need for a medical school. You can't get outside a passion to do it. So,
I have to agree with you. I think the expertise is in the room already, right? This is the room where it has to happen. That would be a fantastic.
Yeah, we see a message. It's been done in El Paso already once. Why not again?
I often get asked that question from prospective students because I work a lot with the undergraduate students who are interested in medical school. And that is a question that always comes up, is how many medical schools out there are just geared towards the Latino, Latinx community. That's their focus, their faculty, administration, look like me, sound like me, eat like me, dance like me, all that. And that's a question that always comes up. So I love this moonshot idea, and put me on that ticket.
So I would just add, if I could just add how important it was to have Associate Dean Flores co-moderate with Associate Dean Vela, and to have Dean Dickerman present with founding dean of the Osteopathic Medical School at Kansas Health Sciences Center, along with Dr. Skorden and Dr. Acosta, because it is a true reflection of our community of LMSA. LMSA is invested in supporting our osteopathic and allopathic communities wholeheartedly in an equitable manner. And it was critical to have both represented here to understand both communities' needs, especially as our students come under ACGME. I will say, so I want to thank Dr. Kane, Dr. Dickerman, and everyone, Associate Dean Flores, for really making that happen. Beyond that, I also want to mention that LMSA has been considering this idea of a LHS Plus, or Hispanic Serving Institution Medical School. As you know, there are 4 HBCU medical schools across this country that produce 75% of all African American and Black identified medical school graduates. And if it wasn't for those 4 HBCUs, can you imagine the state of affairs in this country as they produce 75%? The unique role and benefit that we all gain from by having HBCUs. And I just wonder if we would have had the forethought 60, 80 years ago to invest in a Hispanic serving institution medical school, where we might be today, learning from their history and their journey and their future. So it is an outcome that Dean Dickerman, I hope we can follow up with you, Dean De La Rosa, Dean Breer, Dean Rodriguez. So thank you for that.
I wanted to make a comment. It is sad. I heard the previous conversation when we talked about the LCME schools in Puerto Rico that have done this, but how poor acceptance there is of the students that graduate from that school. And it's sad to hear that. Again, I think we've got to change our perspective. I know program directors are looking. I've been a program director, and we all look at ways to narrow the list down, and we can't. We have to look at how, look at the big list and say, how can this change how we're providing our care? But as I said, I think the expertise is there. Probably the schools are there. It's just we've got to. I would love it that we would have non-Hispanic students want to get into these schools because they have raised the bar.
And I would say those schools in Puerto Rico are very competitive. The University of Puerto Rico is a very competitive school, equally to here. Being born there, raised there, having gotten into the UPR, but decided to come here to see what the US is like. It still produces very good students.
I would guess they're exceptional. As I said, you have to look at our system. We're not creating the physicians that need to change the system. We have got to begin to look at people with better ideas, better approaches. I truly believe that. So your students are probably better prepared to change how we're delivering care than we have done traditionally.
Well, all of the presentations in this session have been critical to our understanding of where we are today We have about 10 minutes left, folks. I don't want you to lose these 10 minutes with Dr. Dickerman and Dr. Acosta present. Please bring forward your questions, put them into the chat, and help us make the most of the last 10 minutes in this session. I know that we talked about building new medical schools, supporting the schools in Puerto Rico. We do have a question here from Donald Rodriguez. In hearing your point on fear of failure, I thought about instances in which a desire to not do anything differently prevails over the desire to enact change, more so than overt fear. How do you suggest we push against inertia in hiring practices and recruitment, etc.? For example, how do you convince entities to go for the external search rather than limit their search to internal candidates?
Well, it's a fundamental change of thought, but I think just look at the most successful organizations. I mean, I think if you look financially at Apple and Google and those organizations, that's exactly how they did it. They said, we don't want to be good, we want to be great. And I think we've all heard the saying, perfect is the enemy of good. Trying to be too perfect is good, but the enemy of great is good. Settling for good will mean you'll never be great. So I think it's that concept that we can always be better, and that's a striving to consistently be better and not settle for the status quo. That is a different thought, and there is risk.
Maybe I can just add to that as well. I think it was brought up earlier in the dean session, and also with Scott today, is that I think what makes a difference is leadership does make a difference, whether we like it or not. The leadership matters. And so when you have people have a mindset like Dr. Dickerman does, Scorton, and some of that, and I even think about Joe Greer, the reality, these people are intentional. They've seen the problems with the system and they want to change the system, but they also put themselves in a position where they can actually change the system that they're at. And I think, what's really hard is when we have traditional that people have been essentially embedded into the infrastructure for 20, 30 years, that's more difficult to change. But I think about these new medical schools that have been developed over the last 10 to 20 years, there's that space to really, you are what you choose. And we have to really think about the leadership, especially as we, cast our mark for the future. What kind of a leadership, including deans, chancellors, et cetera, department chairs, that we're going to need to lead us into that future, because we need a whole different subset of folks now that are much different thinkers than we hired 20 years ago that are still in place. And so again, I think we have to rethink that system about even term limits for our department chairs, but even for some of our people in leadership positions, right? If we're really going to really change that leadership and make a big difference. Because some of these folks, again, because they have tenure, because they're protected in other ways, can't leave, or we can't get rid of them, sort of this piece. I think the reality is that we have to kind of also relook at our system, because our system is built on hierarchy and it's built on power differential that we refuse to change because the people who are in charge keep it happening. So, but I think when we start seeing these examples like Dr. Dickerman is painting for us and others, many like him, I think that's what's going to make the difference for us, because we're silent when it comes down to the status quo. If we stay with the status quo, it remains the same. So I think leadership is going to have to be the key. It's not the only thing, but it plays a big part about choose the difference that you want to be in the future. Because if you keep choosing the same people, things don't change.
Thank you.
I have a question for Dr. Dickerman. You have been talking incredible about promote and predict, good and great. What about leadership and humility?
I would argue the biggest. I think that's a challenge. How do you become a good leader? And I think a good answer is when you look at a pack of wolves, the leader of the pack is at the back. It's the oldest and wisest wolf. And the reason is that they're in the back to make sure that the strongest are in the front, that all the others are protecting the middle, but more importantly, to make sure no one's lost. And I think my position as a leader, as I was taught, I've had a lot of leadership. My job is to make sure that everybody has the resources to excel at their job. That's it. That's simple. That's my simple definition of leadership. I give direction as little as possible. I try to empower. And I think it is a different perspective. And I've been very fortunate of being taught those lessons.
Fantastic.
So Monica, I have
I have
a question.
A question for Dr. Acosta. This is Pedro Mancias. So when you put up the data, David, about, promotion or, going up to pick up on it is time. That's just something that, our faculty don't have, especially URMs. Do you know what the data is there for promotion?
I don't have it at the top of my head, but it's something that we can actually get. The reality is again, when you look at women and
It's the only thing.
I was just going to say, when you look at the data, and we've studied this over the last 20 to 30 years, when you look at the data about promotion, it's still pretty stagnant because the majority of women and URMs, are still at the assistant professor level, and they're there for more than 10 years even, sort of thing.
Yeah, there's a presentation we're going to give on the numbers of promotion based on the AAMC in December 2020. It was like, for assistant professors, there was about 7% of Hispanic representation out of 80,000 faculty. And for professorship was 4% out of, I forgot the number, but it was 4% representation. So the numbers are really low.
But I think what Dr. Mancias is commenting on is that the research has shown that for Hispanics, Blacks, and Indigenous, it could take twice as long to move up every tier in comparison to their counterparts. I think that's what you were alluding to, Dr. Mancias. And I think, Dr. Acosta, what you were mentioning is that analysis might be forthcoming. Is that an analysis that you think is forthcoming in any upcoming AAMC publications, and looking at how long it takes people stratified by race and ethnicity to move from assistant to associate to full?
I think it has been published but it's old, and I think it has to be reviewed. It's an analysis and brief that looked at it probably about 10 years ago. Could have been a little bit more than that. That basically that we can allude to, and I can try to find that, or Juan I'm going to see if Juan posted it at all.
These publications are so critical to bringing change to institutions, because often if it's not published, we can't use the data to leverage change. How do we ensure that we are publishing specifically on our communities and introducing that data at the highest leadership levels?
Yeah. What I would recommend, Monica, is again, work with the AAMC. We have actually a good central data department now and queried it at your level, your institution, but also to figure out exactly what that is, because we do have that data, and it takes just a little bit of mind digging that we can do. That's how we assist our medical schools with that. But come at it with a specific question which you want answered, sort of the thing as well too. But again, AAMC's got so much data; it's quite amazing. But they can actually help make that case as well.
Yes, absolutely. Sounds like you need a team.
So I just want to also take the opportunity to make a couple of mentions. Help me in thanking our phenomenal speakers. Let me start off by special thanks to Dr. Skordin, who just had to step away to manage federal efforts. Dr. Acosta, which many of you people may not remember, that he is the first Chief Diversity Officer of LHS identity. And for myself and for many of us, if not all of us, he's been an inspirational role model and mentor and sponsor. And it is so important to stay connected with him. I will be frank, and this is probably because of my upbringing. I hope that a lot more questions will come through in the chat box for the upcoming sessions today and tomorrow. The speakers today are truly incredible. I would hope that you all follow up with Dr. Acosta and join his team in advocating for the LHS Plus community, but all diverse communities. And so thank you again, Dr. Acosta, for everything. And Dean Dickerman, we look forward to working with you and Associate Dean Flores and Dr. Kane to support the osteopathic community to its fullest. And hopefully we'll work out. Maybe the osteopathic schools will have the first Hispanic serving medical school, right? That is the question. Who is it going to be, allopathic or osteopathic? So the challenge is afoot and in front of us. And to Dr. Vela, who in the same fashion as Dr. Acosta has been just such an incredible sponsor. So please help me in giving them a huge round of applause for their ongoing efforts and being here today. We're gonna take a 45-minute break. If I have the schedule in front of me correctly, we will come back at 12, let's say 12:30. So please do your charts, take care of the kids, la familia, eat some food, do the bathroom break, the laundry, whatever you need. Please come back for the second session of our phenomenal speakers. I'll stay on if people have questions. All right. Thank you, everyone.